Good morning, everybody. Welcome on in. It's your Sunrise Book Club. It is the beautiful month of October. So, we're going to be focusing on, well, like we usually do, the more spooky and the more fun. Today, we are learning about not only the discovery of remote viewing, the two Stanford Research Institute physicists who proved remote viewing is true. We're going to learn a little bit about that discovery. We're also going to learn a little bit about two great American heroes, in my opinion, and that is Ingo Swann and Pat Price, great American psychics. They helped old Russell Targ and Harold Puthoff prove that remote viewing and other psychic abilities are real. We're going to be reading from one of my favorite mind blowers, and that is Mind Reach. If you've never heard of this book, it's a great one. It's by old Russell Targ and Harold Puthoff there. There at the top. I think the people at the bottom are editors or something. Anyways, and a very cool, that's our minds, man. You crack the thin shell of your mind, inside is the universe. So that's what we're going to be reading from today, learning about psychic abilities. And then after, since it is the month of Ghosts and Ghoulies, we are going to continue reading stories, selected stories from the Encyclopedia of Ghosts. Let's jump into the fun for today. And of course, as always, we are in the wasteland out here in the Appalachians, because it's crazy. I'm even noticing a little lag in this screen. Is that true? Okay, so we're out here in the wasteland, the Appalachians. And welcome on in to the hot tub in Fallout 76. This is a great game if you enjoy building and hanging out and kind of a low stakes survival MMO. You can't really be too much of a jerk in this game because, well, PvP isn't that rewarding, and if you're not, it takes a lot. If you're not like set up to do it, it would take a lot to kill me if I don't agree to PvP. But anywho, welcome on in, everybody. Today we are jumping into, as I said at the top of the show, Mind Reach. We are going to start with a little section on the discovery of remote viewing to introduce two of my favorite psychics, and that is Pat Price and Ingo Swann, two historical psychics. I just kind of think they're kind of like, to me, they're like the bad boys of the psychic world. Pat Price being this retired detective who always was able to solve crimes on a hunch. And rumor has it, when they went and visited him in one of the places he was staying, he had a map on the wall. And on this map, there were all these little dots, little push pins. And they're like, Pat, what's that? And he was like, whoa, what do you mean? I track all the... let me turn the game volume down here. I track all the nuclear submarines, Soviet and American, in the world. I'm able to see where they are. And of course, he gets in with the studies. He gets in with the government as well. We'll hopefully learn a little bit about that in this book. And he starts remote viewing for them. And then turns out he was able to guess exactly where those nuclear subs were. So interesting stuff. That's Pat Price. Ingo Swann is he's the dude who did this art on the front of the book. He's a very cool. I mean, I've seen what's cool is on the old Twitters. I follow some sci-fi art accounts. One of them is called Cosmic Slop. Very recommended if you're into that sort of thing. But Ingo Swann made this. He was kind of a sci-fi artist too. New York dude, I believe. We'll learn more about him though today. New York dude, artist man. Man about town, all around cool dude, was able to remote view. He was one of the best remote viewers in the experiment, and we'll go through some of those experiments today. But let's get into the discovery of remote viewing. And for those of you unaware or not, who don't know, remote viewing is the ability for us to take our consciousness and actually project it to somewhere else. And be able to see what's going on there. Now, remote viewers have claimed to be able to go all the way to like the freaking moon and beyond. And also, they've claimed to be able to see in the past, as well as a hazy version of the future. So we're going to learn about where that psychic ability comes from and how it was discovered, because it is something that was proven by Russell Targ and Harold Puthoff to be real. Each and every one of us can remote view. So let's learn about that through our boys Ingo and Pat. The discovery of remote viewing. And the authors of this book are Harold. Oh no, I accidentally pulled out one of my other markers. It's okay. We got a table of contents. The authors of this book, Russell Targ and Harold Puthoff. So when you hear me say like for us or I or whatever it is, that's who's talking. And they both wrote the book, so they kind of switch off. The discovery of remote viewing. For us, the discovery of remote viewing began with two men whom we found to have much more than an average ration of psychic ability, and who furthermore were extremely articulate about how it functioned. These men were Ingo Swann, a New York artist, and Pat Price, a former police commissioner and recent president of a coal company in West Virginia. They virtually taught us how to research psychic phenomena by giving us the insight to focus on those aspects of psychic functioning that people find natural to use in their daily lives. This insight contained two important truths. First, we learned that to ask a subject to do our experiment rather than his is analogous to asking a pianist who shows up for an audition to play a piccolo. Second, the more difficult and challenging the task, the more likely the results will be good. So just to talk about the first one, because I had to pause on that, it confused me a little bit. What he's talking about when he's saying it's like asking a pianist to play a piccolo, or it's like saying what he's saying is when you ask the subject to do their experiment rather than the subject's own experiment, what they mean with psychic abilities is you can't ask someone who says, oh, I could remote view to move something with their mind. They won't be able to do it. You lean into what the person claims they can do. And then you make an experiment that's scientifically sound around that with all, the rules of experimentation and all that fun stuff. That's more what they're talking about. And what I love is the second truth that they came to learn in these experiments was that the more challenging the task, the more likely the results will be good. Because we learn in the beginning of this book, and I read that section a little bit ago, I'll have it up on the tubes in a little bit, but that it's all about belief. A lot of this is about belief, like how well you're able to remote view is about how well you are actually able to believe that you can, and how well you're able to get your mind in that meditative state. And that goes back to the Mechanics of Consciousness, the book we'll be reading tomorrow morning, that talks about how the interconnectedness of consciousness and how we are all able to communicate in that way. When we hit a certain frequency, we are all actually connected. So cool stuff. This kind of goes with that. It backs that up. All right. Our subjects who can describe remote scenes in extraordinary detail when the necessity level is up often can't do better than anyone else trying to see a picture on the wall in the next room, a task seen by them to be a trivialization of their great ability. So you got to ask these guys to do great things, not little minute things, because that's like an insult. You got to prime your brain to do something great, not to set it up to just focus on something small and possibly fail. It's kind of just like, it's like manifestation and positive thought. If we had begun with targets in the next room yielding little success, it probably wouldn't have occurred to us to try the seemingly more difficult remote viewing. As we have become known in the public mind as investigators of such phenomena, we have been the recipients of phone calls and letters, the volume of which indicates that the world is filled with individuals, and many in high places, who have experienced this phenomena, but would not readily admit it. This leads us to hypothesize that the ability is natural and innate. In order to develop this ability in a disciplined fashion, it is useful to arrange for the selection of unknown targets by a second person to maximize the surprise element and minimize the educated guessing. So that's what they're talking about, is how they set these experiments up. They would do it so an unknown person, unknown to the experimenter, as in the scientist observing the remote viewer, and the person claiming to be able to remote view, Unknown to both of them, this third party would select a remote location for the remote viewer to try and see with their consciousness. Kind of like a double blind type deal to keep the experiment legit. So there couldn't be, like they're saying here, educated guessing. It is also helpful to arrange for feedback. For example, by a visit to the target site when the experiment is over, so the false images of memory and imagination can be separated from the true images of the place or person one tried to visit. Our contribution in the laboratory has been just this: to set up a random protocol for target selection and to give our subjects feedback and reinforcement. One result of such a protocol is that, unlike the usual experience in card guessing experiments, our subjects get better rather than worse as they continue to work. So those card guessing games like the one in Ghostbusters, those are not a good gauge, apparently, according to, I believe that's what I'm gleaning here. Those are not a good gauge of psychic ability. The task needs to be bigger. Those minute tasks or small things like that are more up to chance than they are up to our consciousness reaching into a higher state of awareness and being able to view something thousands of miles away. One contribution in the laboratory, oh, we already did that. One result of such a protocol is that, oh, we did that too. My bad. From the beginning of parapsychological research, the hope has been that a repeatable experiment could be found, one that gave concrete evidence of psychic functioning. Along with this has been a need for psychic subjects who don't lose their ability as they continue to do experimental work. Charles Tart has written extensively about the so-called decline effect, in which subjects engaged in repetitious tasks such as card guessing can be counted on to lose their high-scoring talents. He considers card guessing experiments to be a technique for extinguishing psychic functioning in the laboratory. Interesting. That is, they bore subjects into a decline effect. Therefore, we avoid repetitious tasks whenever possible. I think this is really important to think about, this whole idea of avoiding repetitious tasks and how damning and damaging, apparently, if we're going to go with what Charles Tart is saying, a repetitious task can be to your psyche or to your mind. Makes me think about work. Makes me think about like the world we live in and what we have to do from day to day to survive and all that good stuff. Oh, look, we're getting some lag right now. Sorry, folks. But very interesting that it's more, this card guessing stuff is more of a technique for extinguishing psychic functioning. And you have to like excite the brain. It's like when you teach it for students, because my specialty is students who really have a hard time learning in the classroom setting. It's boring to them. They're understimulated, overstimulated, whatever it may be, or the kids are just like act out, or other teachers think are like bad kids. There is no bad kid, just FYI. The kids can't be repetitious and it can't be boring. Got to bring the spice. And it's just like with these psychic experiments, which I love, is your brain would get bored. Your psychic abilities get bored with these minute tasks, because what you're doing when you're using these psychic abilities, if we're to walk with everything that we've been reading, and again, I don't know crap about farts, so don't, I'm just some dude, just going off of what I read. But if we're talking about the mechanics of consciousness and how they view psychic ability, and how when you are using that psychic ability, you're putting your mind in a higher state of awareness, or you're putting your mind to a higher reality, or, oh my gosh, the lag is killing me right now. You're putting your mind to a higher reality, right? You're stepping in, your consciousness is stepping into the intuitive reality, or up into the absolute, right? If you're really able to meditate and get there. So when you're able to put your mind at a higher consciousness, at a higher state of awareness, you're able to access these abilities. And that makes sense that if you're doing something super boring and repetitious, that would fade away, because why the heck would the powers that be in the other realities care about those minute details? They want to show us the deeper truth, the universal truth. They want to show us what our minds can actually do. So it makes sense that repetitious task would just make that fade away. But also very, very interesting. With regard to physical factors that might play a role in remote viewing, we found out early in our work that electrical shielding did not in any way seem to diminish the quality or accuracy of remote viewing. Our next task was to determine whether distance between the subject and the target site would be a significant factor. Hal Puthoff was to be the target as he traveled through Costa Rica. Two subjects in Los Angeles and Menlo Park who said they had never been to Costa Rica were asked to participate in the series. So Hal Puthoff, one of the scientists that wrote this book, he's in Costa Rica. They have two subjects, one in Los Angeles, one in Menlo Park, Chicago. And those two remote viewers or test subjects, they're going to try and see what Hal Puthoff is doing in Costa Rica on certain days, without knowing at all, without any contact with old Hal Puthoff. Hal was to spend 10 days traveling through Costa Rica on a combination of business and pleasure trip. This was all the subjects knew about the itinerary. Hal was to keep a detailed record of his location and activities, including photographs on each of the 7 target days at 1:30 p.m. California time. A total of 12 descriptions were collected before Hal's return. 6 responses from one subject, 5 from another, and 1 response from an SRI researcher who filled in one day when one subject was not available. Again, this is going to help prove that everyone has this ability to remote view if you can get your mindset right. The single response submitted by the experimenter filling in as a subject was a drawing submitted for a day in the middle of the series. Although Costa Rica is a mountainous country, the subject unexpectedly perceived Hal at a beach and ocean setting. With some misgivings, he described an airport and a sandy beach and an airstrip with the ocean at the end. Correct. He also drew an airport building with a large rectangular overhang. Also correct. So this person had never been to Costa Rica, and he correctly guessed that Hal was at an airport that day. And I'll show you the drawing he did. So you see the drawing that the dude did was up top. Whoop! The drawing the dude did is up top, and then the actual, and I'll post this too, so we get to get a better of a look. The actual airfield. So very similar. I know you're like, well, duh, most airfields look the same. Well, okay, but he described down to a T that the ocean was at the end, right? And there was a large building with a rectangular overhang. Both of those were correct. Those seem like kind of minute details that would be hard to get if you're just guessing what an airport was looking like. And plus, he didn't know Hal was at the airport. That's the thing. It's not that he was able to see an airport in Costa Rica. We could all guess what an airport looks like. He was able to guess that Hal was there. Not guess, know that Hal was there that day just by projecting his consciousness, thinking about where's Hal Puthoff in Costa Rica. Those were the images that came to his mind. Hal had taken a one-day unplanned side trip to an offshore island, and at the time of the experiment had just disembarked from a plane at a small island airport as described by the subject. The sole discrepancy was that the subject's drawing showed a hut type of building in place of the rectangular structure. The above illustrates 2 major points observed a number of times throughout the program. First, contrary to what might be expected, a subject's description does not necessarily portray what might reasonably be expected to be correct, an educated or safe guess, but as often runs counter even to the subject's own expectations. Second, it is a typical example of an individual with no claim to paranormal ability experiencing remote viewing. So this SRI employee, guy who worked at the Stanford Research Institute, had no prior abilities, no inclination that he had psychic abilities, but he was able to produce this, a remote viewing result that was accurate. The remaining submissions in the Costa Rica experiment provided further examples of excellent correspondences between target and response. A target period of poolside relaxation was identified. A drive through a tropical forest at the base of a truncated volcano was described as a drive through a jungle below a large bare table mountain. So close, right? A hotel room target description, including such details as rug color, was correct, and so on. To determine whether such matches were simply fortuitous, that is, could reasonably be a result of chance alone. When Hal returned, he was asked to blind match the 12 descriptions to his 7 target locations. On the basis of the evaluation procedure, which vastly underestimates the statistical significance of the individual descriptions, 5 correct matches were obtained, a result significant of the odds of 50 to 1. As encouraging as such a statistic is, it fails to convey the impact of reading the transcript of an excellent description, as some were. Okay, so there we go, right? He's basically at the end here breaking it down for us, being like, look, we really put all the rules on this experiment. There's no way that it could have just been pure chance. The chances of it being pure chance are 50 to 1 in this case. And he's also just mentioned at the end to read the transcripts, which maybe we will. I was thinking, that might be boring. Maybe we will read a couple of the transcripts of the experiments, just so you could experience how detailed the remote viewers get when they're remote viewing. But just as psychic functioning in general was not invented in the laboratory, but rather had its own existence in the field, so too did remote viewing thrive as an ability decades before we thought to investigate it. Examples of remote viewing experiments are described in the 4-volume 1927 Outline of Science, edited by J. Arthur Thompson. Among its sections on biology, chemistry, and physics is a section entitled Psychic Science, nestled between applied science, flying, and natural history, botany. The section on psychic science is written by Sir Oliver Lodge, who introduces his subject with the following ideas. 2 branches of knowledge, the study of the mind and the study of matter, have usually been dealt with separately, and the facts have been scrutinized by different investigators, the psychologists and the physicists. The time is coming when the study of these apparently separate entities must be combined to ascertain the real nature of the connection. Whether those possibilities are generally recognized or not is the object of psychic science. In the subsection entitled Telepathy at a Distance, Lodge describes a series of experiments which sound like our own remote viewing studies. Lodge writes, in order to ascertain whether distance was any obstacle in telepathy, 2 ladies, members of the Society for Physical Research in London, who knew that they were often in telepathic rapport, decided to keep a record of what one perceived and what the other saw at a certain time each day. When they were hundreds of miles apart, their descriptions being sent to the office of the society, there to be compared. The illustrations below must serve as samples of a large number of recorded observations. Those figures are reported here in Figure 4. These researchers, like us, did not observe any decrease in accuracy with increasing distance. So here we go. I'll post this too, but just so you all who are live with me can also see. Sorry, I didn't know there were such good pictures. I would have had these ready for you. But, so these are the 2 ladies that I just read. When they're 100 miles apart, 2 best friends. That's cool. A fun experiment to do with your friend. You should try it. You got a best friend who's 1,000 miles away. At a certain time of day, each day, tell that friend, write down what you're doing, and I'll write, write down what you think I'm doing, and I'll write down what I think you're doing, and then compare notes. You can see here, the description. I'll read the descriptions after, but this, in the bottom corner here, yeah, that's the lady's drawing, and that's the picture of where the other lady was at. Same in the top, and you can see pretty accurate. That's the lady's drawing, and then next to where the other lady was actually at. So, 2 friends remote viewing each other. How fun. How fun. Yeah, so the first one was Henbury Church. This is what Miss Miles in the South photographed as a place she had been visiting. That's the picture. Then on the right, this is what the Miss Ramsden in Scotland drew, adding something is wanting as it seemed bigger and more imposing. So she was right. Her little picture, she's like, nah, but something's missing from this picture. It's a bigger and more imposing building. You're right, it's a church, and it was also missing the graveyard from the front. Now, the second one on the bottom here, the photograph by Miss Miles of a silk factory at Mousenbury in Wiltshire. The The precipient, or the person remote viewing, Miss Ramsden, had never been to Malmesbury and was at the time in Scotland when she drew and described what she thought was in Miss Miles's neighborhood as follows: a waterfall. It looks artificial because it's very broad and regular, not more than 2 or 3 feet high. It might be a mill stream. Then I begin to see a house, a farmhouse, with a very tall poplar near it. There is a rising ground, not to be called hills, and young plantations. And then she drew this diagram. So pretty accurate there too, with the poplar trees right by the building. Crazy stuff. So that's kind of the discovery of remote viewing. I love how they bring up that there were other scientists who already did this work back in 1927. But as we read in a lot of things that mentioned this in Mind Reach, mentioned in the Mechanics of Consciousness, oftentimes when the human brain is, or when we, just people in general, when you're presented with something extraordinary, you just kind of choose not to believe it. You're just like, nah, I don't think so. So there's tons of evidence for psychic abilities and at least remote viewing. And it's been proven a couple different times by different physicists and psychologists. So it's just funny that it's still hard to believe. You know, it's even hard. It's hard for me to believe that I could remote view. So that's why I know, man, I got to meditate more. I got to get on it. Anywho, I mean, it's like it's my own blockage, you know, preventing me from accessing the wonder of an expanded consciousness or awareness. It's interesting. So that's kind of the discovery of remote viewing, how they did it through experiments with Ingo Swann, Pat Price, and other just random people. And then we had another example of 2 best friends from the 20s who were remote viewing what each other were doing, and they were pretty accurate. Next, we're going to learn about Ingo Swann, the armchair traveler. So we're going to get there, so stay with me. We're going to talk about the experiment first, then we're going to learn a little bit about Ingo Swann, then we're going to fast forward and learn a bit about Pat Price. And then we're going to wrap it up and maybe move over to some ghost stories for a bit of the rest of the morning. Oh, my controller. All right, hold on there, folks. Let me actually plug this in so we're not totally doinked. Okay, let me move around so you don't get booted from the game. Whoa, too much. Easy, bud. There we go. Ingo Swann, the armchair traveler. We're going to start off by a quote from a paraphrasing Leon Festinger. There will be those who accept it with joy because they know it is true, what was true all along. And there will be those for whom it will bring pain, for it exposes an inadequacy in their worldview. And I think that's what I deal with. I was like such a skeptic about everything for so long in my life. Absolutely everything. That like all the new information I'm learning, it just rocks my inadequacies of my own worldview. I realize how small and narrow my worldview was, and it makes you not want to accept things, but you got to. It's a beautiful, big, and complicated place we live in. Okay, let's go. What's a nice physicist like you doing in a research area like this? This question comes to mind whenever I, Harold Puthoff, see the latest spat of sensational publicity misrepresenting our research, the research into psychic abilities, and misinterpreting and exaggerating our results. Fortunately for my sanity, I feel that the past 3 years work has given me good answers to those questions. Although I was certainly casually interested in popular reports of ESP research, my professional involvement with research into paranormal phenomena did not begin until 1972. At that time, I had submitted a proposal to Research Corporation, which was handling a laser patent for me to obtain funds for some basic research into quantum biology. In the introduction to that proposal, I had raised the issue of whether physical theory, as we know it, is capable of describing life processes. I then went on to suggest possible areas of investigation that might shed light on the issue. These included measurements with both plants and lower organisms. This proposal was widely circulated, and a copy was sent to Cleve Baxter in New York, who was involved in measuring the electrical activity of plants with standard lie detector equipment. And we learned about these guys a little bit too in the mechanics of consciousness, learning that plants do communicate and they are conscious. When New York artist Ingo Swann visited Baxter's laboratory, he chanced to see my proposal and subsequently wrote to me on March 30th, 1972. In his letter, Swann described his successful work in psychokinesis with Dr. Gertrude Schmeider, Department of Psychology, City College of New York. Swann argued persuasively that experiments of the type Swann argued persuasively that experiments of the type he had been involved in might be appropriate for investigating the boundary between physics of the animate and inanimate. Although my proposal, which was funded in April of that year by the Science Unlimited Research Foundation of San Antonio, Texas, was not specifically directed towards parapsychology research, I nonetheless invited Swann to the Stanford Research Institute for a week of experiments to see whether his abilities could provide a vehicle for investigating quantum biological effects. In preparing for Swann's arrival in June, I discussed with various physicists at Stanford University the experimental setups in use which operated near absolute zero temperature. I hypothesized that this was the type of device which would be optimum for investigating mind over matter phenomena. Several superfluid and superconductivity experiments met this requirement in principle, but only one setup was running and available. This particular piece of equipment was a superconducting magnetometer, the electrical equivalent of a super-sensitive magnet compass needle, which could register magnetic fields in order of the 1/1,000,000th of the Earth's field. So this is like when we learned about this in the mechanics of consciousness. This machine that he's describing, this superconducting magnetometer, that is to measure the Earth's electromagnetic field. And then what he was describing before in the beginning of this paragraph, I believe, he's talking about how this is the perfect experimental conditions for a psychic, because if they're truly able to manipulate the electromagnetic fields of Earth, this needle would be able to pick it up. He would be able to easily manipulate it because it's like it's a super needle. It can detect things that are 1/1,000,000th that of Earth's field. So that means really, really, really minute changes in the electromagnetic field. So this is the setup that they're going to test Ingo Swann on to see if he can move that needle just with his mind by manipulating the magnetic fields. This setup was part of an apparatus built to detect quarks, particles hypothesized to be the basic building blocks of matter. I arranged with Dr. Heberd, whose experiments were in progress, for us to have occasional use of the equipment. I met Ingo at the San Francisco airport, armed with only a verbal description of his looks and the information that he would be smoking a cigar. Tight. I was to find that the ubiquitous cigar would become a permanent part of my scenery over the next year. A cigar-smoking man. It is hard to remember what I expected a psychic to be like, but I knew right away that Ingo did not fit my preconceived image. He was a large man, good-humored and extremely thoughtful and articulate. In place of the bravado I thought I might have to contend with, I found an unexpected sensitivity. Our conversation quickly turned to the details of what does or does not constitute proof in an experiment. What safeguards had to be taken to ensure that false data due to artifacts or subliminal cueing were not entered into the already polluted stream of popularly believed psychic marvels and so forth. Is that okay? Yeah, I think that should be okay. Because we're hitting over that. Okay. I was to find out that what has now been reported to me from other labs that Ingo would often be the first to discount an apparent success, pointing out that some potential loophole in a protocol or possible misinterpretation of the data. So Ingo was a serious dude. He took this ability seriously, and he really wanted to prove that he had it. So he was very serious about the experiments and making sure there were no loopholes. Like he said, no queuing, looked overviewing every success with a fine-tooth comb, just really figuring it out. Ingo asked me what was on the schedule for the day. Choosing my words carefully, I said that we were going to Stanford University's Varian Physics building, where a well-shielded apparatus known as a quark detector was situated, launching into a discussion of nuclear particles such as protons, which until recently had been classified as elementary particles. I explained how these were now thought by some physicists to be composed of even smaller subunits called quarks, and that a number of laboratories were endeavoring to find free quarks in nature. They're trying to get down to the smallest parts of life. I carefully refrained from mentioning the apparatus in any more detail so that the experimental environment would be a surprise. This was in part so that I could judge his ability to obtain information from an environment which contained much that I thought would be a mystery to him. Also, everything I had read in my self-imposed instant education process over those past 2 months had been indicated that fresh, spontaneous situations often contribute to better performance, paralleling more closely with natural conditions, under which high-quality paranormal functioning often occurs. You got to keep it natural when you're studying it. That's so interesting. We arrived in the basement of the Varian Physics building, ready to discover whether rapport between man and magnetometer was possible, so communicating with the machine, just with his mind. Dr. Hebert greeted us, rather skeptical about the whole procedure, but willing to observe. Dr. Martin Lee, a physicist at Stanford Linear Accelerator Center, and an interested colleague joined us. So we have 3 big dog skeptical scientists here with old cigar smoking Ingo, who claims that he's going to be able to move this needle with his mind, do a very locked, shielded apparatus. Ingo looked somewhat shocked and dismayed to find he was supposed to affect a small magnetic probe located in a vault below the floor of the building and shielded by a mu metal magnet shield, an aluminum container, copper shielding, and most important, a superconducting shield, the best kind of shield known. So this thing, oh wow, okay, I'm going to show you a figure of it. First, let's look at Ingo Swann himself. So this is the man who's about to face off against the machine. Ingo Swann, the cigar smoking badass artist from New York. There he is right there. And he arrives and they tell him, you're going to be using your mind to not only go underground, but penetrate something that is shielded by mu metal, a magnetic shield, aluminum container, copper shielding, and most importantly, a superconducting shield, the best kind of shield known. And this is what that looked like here. So this is what he was. So I'm going to post this too, so if you watch on the tubes, you'll get a little more detailed view of it. But you can see it's surrounded by concrete blocks, right? And it's below the floor of the building. So he's competing with a lot here. So let's see if he's able to move the needle. Ingo said later that perhaps it was his state of shock that propelled him into a significantly altered state of consciousness to permit him to obtain the good results that followed. Before the experiment, a decaying magnetic field had been set up inside the magnetometer, and this provided a background calibration signal that registered as an oscillating signal on the chart recorder. Oscillating remember, moving back and forward. And if you remember our book we're cruising through tomorrow, The Mechanics of Consciousness, we learned how oscillating fields is basically how the whole universe works. We are all vibrating in that kind of in that way. The system had been running for about an hour with no noise, and the oscillation was being traced out in a stable pattern by a chart recorder. So that's like this, up and down waves. Ingo was shown the setup and told that if he were to affect the magnetic field in the magnetometer, it would show up as a change in the output recording. Then, according to his own description at the time, he focused his attention on the interior of the magnetometer, at which time, after about 5 seconds delay, the frequency of the oscillation doubled for about 30 seconds, as indicated at A in figure 6. And I'll put that up on the screen. Dr. Hubbard looked startled. The main claim to fame of this device was its impenetrability by outside influences, and Hubbard's work rested on successful operation of this instrument. Oh no! Dr. Hubbard is freaking out, dude. This cigar smoking artist just came in, puffed his cigar. Well, in my mind, puff, puff, and then boom. It was like, oh, your impenetrable machine. Let me see. Let me move the needle. The needle started going crazy. The straightforward interpretation was that magnetic field was decaying at twice the rate expected. In words that we have now become accustomed to whenever we get involved in psychokinetic or PK research with someone else's equipment, Hubbard recovered by saying that perhaps something was wrong with the equipment and suggested that he would be more impressed if Ingo could stop the field change altogether. So again, already this guy, this scientist who observed this thing happen, being like, no, maybe this guy should be something wrong with my machine. It's more impressive if he's able to stop it. A constant complaint of subject in psychokinesis experiments is that no matter what miracles they perform, the first experiment, the experimenter always responds by saying, that was very interesting, but I really would like to see what I would really like to see you do is, which is exactly what happened. Ingo said he would try, and in about 5 seconds, he apparently proceeded to do just that. Indicated at B in the graph, for a period of roughly 45 seconds. At the end of the period, he said that he couldn't hold it any longer and immediately let go, at which time the output returned to normal. So it's like, this is right in front of your face. The dude says, all right, Ingo says, I'm gonna affect the needle. Right after that, the needle moves crazy. The experimenter's like, okay, bud, it's more impressive. Why don't you make it stop? Ingo's like, okay. He makes it stop for a full 45 seconds. Then as soon as Ingo's like, I can't hold it, I gotta let it go, boom, it returns to normal. We asked him what he had done, since as far as we knew, he could hardly be expected to know anything about the magnetic field distribution that had been set up, let alone know what to do to manipulate it inside a complex piece of instrumentation. His answer set us back. He explained that he had direct vision of the apparatus inside, and that apparently the act of looking at different parts resulted in producing the effects. In describing this, he sketched out on the graph a diagram of the interior he saw. It even commenting on the gold alloy plate, which indeed was there, and which had not been brought up in our earlier discussion. During his description of what he had done, further perturbations occurred, as shown in figure D and E in figure 6. We'll throw that up. I had to evaluate for myself whether the system was in fact noisy, and what we were I had to evaluate for myself whether the system was in fact noisy, and what we were observing was merely coincidence. So I asked Ingo to refrain from thinking about the apparatus and talk to him about other things. During this time, the normal pattern was traced out for several minutes. When we began discussing the magnetometer again, the tracing went into a high frequency pattern, as shown on F in the thing now. So when Ingo was thinking about the machine, it made the machine move. When Ingo wasn't thinking about the machine, it went back to normal. Ingo said that he was tired, so we agreed to quit and have lunch. On our way out, I asked Dr. Hubbard to continue monitoring and recording so that we could determine whether the apparatus was behaving erratically. He agreed, and the apparatus was to run for over an hour with no trace of noise or non-uniform activity. The top 2 traces show a continuing record following termination of our experiment, and the third trace was taken a short while later. I could not help but think back over a series of incidents involving sensitive laboratory equipment, a scenario every technologist is aware of. Some graduate students can make anything work, whereas for others, there was clearly no hope. A ghost in the machine? Maybe there was more to that phrase than just the title of Osterkeusler's work. However, that was speculation, not science, and my thoughts return to the issue at hand. Yeah, see, he allows himself to go speculate a little bit, because that's true, that saying of the ghost of the machine, right? Like, sometimes it is weird, something works for someone and just doesn't work for someone else. In retrospect, I realize I must not have really expected excellent results with which a well-shielded with such a well-shielded instrument, for I had not arranged for multiple recordings. Therefore, after the fact, I realized there was no objective way to tell whether the effect really occurred at the probe or in the electronics or in the recording device itself. Ingo's subjective description provided some circumstantial evidence that the effect occurred at the probe, but there was no way after the fact to validate this objectivity. Let me see here. I'm just trying to see. So that is Ingo and the great... I think we'll keep going, actually. That was Ingo and the famous experiment with the magnetometer. We're going to keep reading. Just seeing here. Okay. We returned the next day, but the equipment was behaving erratically. It was not possible to obtain a stable background signal for calibration. Therefore, although Ingo tried, no positive conclusions could be drawn. This in no way cast doubt on the previous day's results, since at that time the perturbations occurred only in conjunction with Ingo's activity, the output remaining stable otherwise. It was nonetheless disappointing, and replication of these results had to wait another year before we obtained the apparatus of our own for an extended study. 2 years passed before independent replication was obtained in another laboratory. So boom, not only were they able to get the magnetometer in their own laboratory and Swann was able to manipulate it, but 2 years later, same results were obtained in a different laboratory. I found myself torn between wanting to follow up on the physical perturbation effects on the one hand, and on the other hand, being equally excited by Ingo's apparent ability to see shielded material. The physical effects would appear to provide an opportunity to examine under laboratory conditions what every quantum theorist knows, that observation of a system changes that system, and the consciousness, and that consciousness might play an important part under certain conditions. However, the description of hidden material seemingly opened Pandora's box to a whole host of possibilities, some of them quite practical. Since this second phenomenon was easier to research, that was the direction on which I settled. To ensure that this apparent ability was stable enough to research, I carried out a short series of experiments before Ingo's return to New York. They were rather simple-minded tests. One researcher would place an object inside of a snap-lock, thick-walled wooden case and leave the area. Then Ingo, accompanied by a second experimenter, would enter the room and describe what he thought was in the case. This approach worked so well that I invited potential sponsors to visit the lab and carry out the experiments themselves in order to determine whether they felt there was something worth investigating. I recall one such visit during which Ingo was at his finest. 2 visitors representing a potential sponsor ran Ingo through a series of 10 hidden object in a box experiments. His descriptions were exceptionally good that day. Motivation was high, but I was especially amazed in one of the series when Ingo said, "I see something small, brown, and irregular, sort of like a leaf or something that resembles it, except that it seems very much alive, like it's even moving." The target chosen by one of the visitors turned out to be a small live moth he had captured, which indeed did look like a leaf. So boom, seeing in the box. And this is an experiment where Ingo could have no idea what's inside that box, and he's able to guess it every time. I recall one such visit, not guess it, he's able to see it every time. He's using psychic ability to see it. See, even in when I'm presented with the experiment itself, right? And I read how like ironclad it is, even my own brain, instead of just saying, oh, he knew because he saw, I naturally just go to saying he guessed it. But he didn't guess it, he saw that, he knew. I recall one such visit during which Ingo was at his finest. 2 visitors representing a potential sponsor. Oh, I already did that. Sorry. Finally, after numerous similar observations, I invited Swann to work with us over an extended period of time. Swann agreed to return to the Stanford Research Institute for an intensive 8-month study after after clearing up some previous commitments in New York. A few months passed, during which time Russell Targ joined the Stanford research staff. Proposals for an additional funding were written, and an initial 6-week investigation of Uri Geller's reported abilities were carried out. That's in chapter 7. We'll learn about Uri Geller another time. He's another great psychic of history. Swann then returned to begin a comprehensive series of experiments touching on many areas. In retrospect, our first experiments were not much different from those done for years in parapsychological research, except for the modern twist added by our high technology environment. Instead of Ingo identifying green and white cards picked at random at a remote location, he was to determine whether a red helium neon laser or green argon laser was activated. Instead of guessing which envelope contained the picture of a man and which a woman, he was to determine which canister contained prothemium-147 radioactive beta source and which contained a ruby razor rod, etc. So bumping up the experiments from simple, boring ones. Now we're dealing with lasers, laser rods, which what the heck is that? And radioactive beta sources. What the heck are those? Although the statistics began to mount and the hypothesis began to emerge, all this work was pale into insignificance on a day that began as any other. We were sitting around drinking for our morning coffee and discussing experimental procedures when Ingo interrupted with, "I'm tired of these parapsychological experiments. They're so boring. Why don't we do something exciting?" I did some experiments at the ASPR in which I moved my viewpoint to some remote location and described what was there. That was fun to do. And the studies were statistically significant. I think I could look anywhere in the world if you just give me some coordinates like latitude and longitude. Let's design an experiment around that. So again, letting in the search of these, like what old Puthoff was talking about at the beginning of this chapter about Ingo, discovering that letting the person with the ability come up with the experiment, not that they design it, because that would be horrible that they design it, but they come up with the idea. Ingo being like, "Yo, let me prove to you that I can see anywhere in the world with my consciousness." There was an awkward silence. In our experimentation, we had been trying to get a few bits of information from one lab to another via our unpredictable and noisy ESP channel. And now suddenly Ingo was proposing an experiment which sounded infinitely more difficult. Besides, we knew that latitude and longitude were completely arbitrary, man-made constructs, adding one impossibility on top of another. Not knowing what to say, we said we should think about it, but we didn't. A few days later, Ingo brought up the subject again. "These ESP experiments are a trivialization of my abilities. I want to look at something more interesting than what is in the next room." Sensing our reluctance to get involved in such experiments, he continued with, "Look, let's just do a few of them for our break. It'll take half an hour at the most, and then we can return to our regular experimentation." Since an argument could hardly be made against such a reasonable request, Russell and I agreed to compile a list of 10 coordinate pairs, latitude and longitude, and let Ingo attempt to give us a brief description of what he thought was there. Since it was just a game, an interlude from our scientific experimentation, we simply consulted a map in an adjacent laboratory and picked out 10 locations widely separated on the surface of the Earth and returned to the laboratory where Ingo was waiting. We read off each target location by latitude and longitude only. He had to immediately state what he perceived. Each response was checked for accuracy and the next coordinates were then given until all 10 of the coordinates were exhausted, a procedure which took roughly 20 minutes. 75 degrees north, 45 degrees west. So here's a transcript. Of what happened. Researchers, 75 degrees north, 45 degrees west. Ingo Swann, ice. Researchers, 50 degrees north, 120 degrees east. Ingo, land, jungles, mountains, peninsular mountains. 38 degrees north, 29 degrees west. Ingo, In my immediate vicinity, ocean. I see Spain off in the distance. And so it went. Not bad. But, of course, we couldn't overlook the possibility that perhaps Ingo knew well the geographical features of the Earth and their approximate location by latitude and longitude. Wait, did they say how much you got right? Oh, and so it went. Not bad, not bad. But of course, we couldn't overlook the possibility that perhaps Ingo knew well the geographical features of the Earth and their approximate location by latitude and longitude. Or it was possible that we were inadvertently cueing the subject since we as experimenters knew what the answers were. On a later day, we ran through another series of 10 pairs. This time, to be on the tricky side, I chose coordinates of small bits of land in the middle of large oceans and small lakes in the midst of land masses. As we ran through this series, it became clear that my trap wasn't working, for Ingo's descriptions continued to show high resolution as he ripped through the session, telling us of islands and small lakes. But that still left the possibility that Russell or I had been cueing him inadvertently, like maybe through the subconsciousness or something. The next time we took a break, we were ready for him. We had arranged with another SRI scientist, Stanford Research Institute scientist, who was admittedly skeptical about the possibility of remote viewing, to bring us a list of 10 pairs of coordinates without telling us what they were corresponded to. As Ingo breezed through the list with confidence, I could hardly wait to learn of the list targets to correlate Ingo's responses after the experiment was over. Once again, even though the descriptions were perhaps a bit vague or a little ambiguous, they were accurate enough to make us begin to wonder whether we had in our hands a case of paranormal remote viewing or paranormal memory. We knew, of course, that there was a phenomenon known as eidetic memory, which enabled a person to close his eyes and reproduce complex pictures from memory. Jules described a case in which, on successive days, a subject was presented with what appeared to be a random dot patterns, but which, when overlaid, actually constituted a recognizable picture. When presented the second pattern, while being asked to recall the first, the subject recognized the picture, a feat paranormal by mundane standards, but nonetheless observable in a laboratory. In any case, the phenomena we were observing with Ingo was interesting enough to take 10 breaks altogether, yielding a total of 100 descriptions, one for each coordinate pair. Details from the final run are shown on table 1. I'll run through this here and I'll show them up here. So the target, 45 north, 150 west, ocean, beautiful blue-green waves, sun shining, ship toward the north. And if you valuation the H there, that means it's a hit. It's a good description. If you look down this list here, he has, of the 10, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 hits. So 7 good descriptions from from the random scientists that picked the locations. Only 2 that are neutral. So some possibility of a correspondence, but pretty accurate. And 1 that was a miss from this chart. Pretty good results if you ask me. At this point, we had circumstantial evidence we were indeed observing a peculiar and highly specific skill. Something was happening, but it was not clear what. Ingo's successes on these map coordinates tasks caused us hours of questioning. As scientists, we had to repeatedly review the possibilities and draft various hypotheses. An individual could, in principle, obtain good results on the basis of eidetic memory. In certain cases, an individual could also, in principle, obtain the data subliminally from the experimenter who knew the target locations. As far as that goes, if we are prepared to consider paranormal hypotheses, we may as well toss in the possibility that the data were obtained paranormally from whoever chose the target, whether that person was present or not. Fortunately, such questions can be tested by the application of proper protocols provided one is seriously motivated to ask the questions and then establish the procedures with the dedication to rigorous scientific method, which old Targ and Puthoff were. It is at this juncture, however, that the matter is usually dropped with the statement, if it could have been done by ordinary means, it probably was done by ordinary means. Once again, Occam's now blunted razor has been used to slice away another potentially valid part of reality of those viewing a phenomenon and decided which of the ordinary means or available hypotheses most fit the existing belief structures. So that's the problem, right? That's what's so hard about like studying new parts of science, depths of the unknown. It's hard to get away from the idea that if it can be explained about ordinary terms, it probably is ordinary and doesn't deserve any more examination. That's what old Targ and Puthoff have to go up against every day. From the scientific standpoint, however, possible circumstantial evidence against an apparent demonstration of paranormal functioning under relatively good conditions has no better footing than circumstantial evidence for paranormal functioning. Either can only indicate hypotheses for further testing under rigorously controlled conditions, since only in that latter case can a scientific statement be made. Intrigued by what we had seen, we set up a pilot study in which a series of targets from around the globe were supplied by Stanford Research Institute personnel and by interested scientists in other laboratories. Countermeasures against the subliminal cueing hypothesis were taken, keeping ourselves as experimenters ignorant of the target until after the experiment. The eidetic memory hypothesis was countered by requiring detail beyond that available on maps, such as the locations of the structural detail of buildings, the shapes of structures such as towers and bridges. Thus was born Project Scanty. Scanning by coordinate. Project Scanate, or scanning by coordinate. It was under Scanate, the Scanate protocol, that we received the coordinates 49, 20 south, 70, 14 east, telephoned to us by a scientist challenging our work. No maps were permitted, and Swann was asked to reply immediately. So here's Swann's response to those coordinates. My initial response is that it's an island, maybe a mountain sticking up through a cloud cover. Terrain seems rocky, must be some sort of small plants growing there. Cloud bank on the west, very cold. I see some buildings rather mathematically laid out. One of them is orange. There is something like radar antenna and a round disc. He draws a map. 2 white cylindrical tanks, quite large, to the northwest. A small airstrip. Wind is blowing. Must be 2 or 3 trucks in front of the building. Behind that, is that an outhouse? There's not much there. Swann also described the coastline of the island, drawing segments of 8.5 by 8.5 by 11 pieces of paper as he went. And that's in this figure 8. That's what he drew. It's not completely dark there, and I'll show y'all who are watching live the picture as well. This is what Ingo drew. The bottom is what he drew, and the top is the actual spoil of the actual map. So that's the actual map. And the bottom there is what Ingo actually drew. You can see pretty close. But let's see how close he was with the buildings and structures. That's where this gets interesting. So I'm going to continue reading his description. It's not completely dark there, sort of orangish light. If I look to the west hills, to the north flatlands, and I think airstrip and ocean, and in the distance to the east, can't see anything to the south. I move to the coastline and follow it around. That's point A. He begins to draw the map. Point B, rocks sticking up out of the ocean, breakers on them. Point C, little cluster of buildings with wharf boats. Point D, a jetty of land sticking out. Point F is a basin river coming through lots of birds. Point E, brush of small trees. This is fun. First time I've done this. Almost a straight coastline, cuts in rocks, beach then curves back. I see to the northwest a mountain rising up slowly on top. Area G is irregular. Point H is a high cliff. Point I is a promontory. Point J has big breakers. K is a bay. L is area. L is area I drew in detail. Circles area draws airstrip and buildings for orientation on previous map. That will do for today. Maybe a lighthouse. I lacked courage going around point G. The coordinates were of an island in the southern Indian Ocean, administered as part of the French southern and Antarctic lands called Kerguelen. Kerguelen now serves primarily as a base for the joint French-Soviet research facility for conducting upper atmospheric meteorological studies. From a scientific standpoint, we are forced to consider every alternative hypothesis conceivable for the generation of the result. For the scientific game is prescribed as a game of chess, looked at through the glasses of science, carefully polished for hundreds of years. The experiment was certainly not definitive, since there was always the possibility that Kerguelen might have been seen at one time or another as the focus of a magazine study or a TV special or some other information source available to the subject. So again, they're saying, like, even though this was crazy, that description we read was very accurate by Ingo, it still is not a perfectly polished scientific experiment, purely for the fact that Ingo could at some point or another during his life seen this French-Soviet research facility on TV or read about it in some sort of magazine or book. But no such criticism could be leveled at the following type experiment, however, of which we did many. A target site somewhere on the East Coast, again designated only by coordinates, was given to us by a scientist outside of the Stanford Research Institute, challenging our work. From the record of that experiment, here it is. Date, May 12th, May 29th, May 12th, my birthday. May 29th, 1973. Time, 4:34 p.m. Stanford Research Institute, Menlo Park, California. Sorry, Menlo Park, California, not Chicago. That's my bad. Protocol. Coordinates given by Dr. H.E. Puthoff. To subject Ingo Swann. To initiate experiment, no maps were permitted, and the subject was asked to give an immediate response. The session was recorded on tape. Ingo. This seems to be some sort of mounds or rolling hills. There's a city in the north. I can see taller buildings, some smog. This seems to be a strange place, somewhat like the lawns that one would find around the military base. But I get the impression that there are either some old bunkers around, or maybe, let me go back here. Hold on. Okay. Okay, old bunkers. Or maybe this is a covered reservoir? There must be a flagpole, some highways to the west, possibly a river over the far east. To the south, maybe more city. He appears to zero in for a closer view, rapidly sketching in the detailed map. I'll put the map up here. This is what he sketched in figure 1. Showing the location of several buildings together with some roads and trees. He goes on. Cliffs to the east, fence to the north. There's a circular building, perhaps a tower, buildings to the south. Is this a former Nike base or something like that? He hands over a detailed map. This is about as far as I can go without feedback or perhaps guidance as to what is wanted. There is something strange about this area, but since I do not know what to look for within the scope of the cloudy ability, it is extremely difficult to make decisions on what there is and what is not. Imagination seems to get in the way. For example, I get the impression of something underground, but I'm not sure. But imagination was not a factor in that decisive day, as we learned a few weeks later when we received a phone call from our challenger. Not only was Swann's description correct in every detail, but even the relative distance on his map was to scale. A fluke? A fantastic coincidence? Hardly. We had given Swann the coordinates and taken his response. We had transmitted his response to the challenger and received the challenger's confirmation, detail by detail, point by point. If the phenomenon proved to be stable in further controlled experimentation, physics as we knew it would experience its greatest challenge. And this was only the beginning of a new idea of man's psychic potential. And that is the discovery of remote viewing through the great American psychic and artist, Ingo Swann. We're going to continue this journey here with old Pat Price, another one of my favorites, sweet old Pat Price. I'm going to be right back. I'm going to take just a quick little break here. Welcome back, welcome back, welcome back. All right. All right, folks. So let's continue, shall we? Oh, I got a whisper from someone. Thank you. Ah. Oh my gosh, I'm just seeing I got a message from someone nice here. Thank you, Mac. So let's continue. Let's learn about Pat Price here. Now, for those of you who do not know, Pat Price was another great American psychic, as is in the title of the stream today. I'll show you his picture here. You see his little cutie, former police chief. Then he ended up, what was he doing? Then he ended up doing something else. Head of a West Virginia coal company after he was a police chief, but also a very powerful psychic. It is rumored, we're not going to get too much into this because this is a very wholesome sciencey book. This little Pat Price right there, check him out, huh? Look at that cutie. He should be in all our history books, but what are we going to do? Now, it's rumored that he worked with the government too. You have to remember when old Pootie and Targi were doing their research here, we were in the height of the Cold War. So there's a great documentary that has Russell Targ in it called Psychic Spies. I believe that's what it's called. I'll put it up here on the tubers, but Psychic Spies during the Cold War, and it talks about Pat Price. You know, Pat Price, suddenly passed away from, I believe it was some sort of heart condition. People like to speculate maybe he was part of the psychic Cold War, and maybe he was a casualty of it. You never know. There's also no, but anywho, let's get into it. Pat Price style. Pat Price. So we have Ingo Swann, the armchair traveler, and then Pat Price. His subtitle here is "A Man for All Seasons," and his quote comes from mathematician David Hilbert. Do you know why? No, you won't turn off in 5 minutes, fool. No, why would you turn off? Hold on. Yeah, no, we're not turning you off. Thank you, console. My console. What are you gonna do? Okay, let's get back to it. Live scene. Here we go. All right, so Pat Price, a man for all seasons. Do you know why Einstein said the most original and profound things about space and time that have been said in our generation? Because he had learned nothing about all the philosophy and mathematics of time and space. Pure mind. That's what Itzhak Bentov talks about in his Mechanics of Consciousness. And look, I'm a teacher, and this is straight up how I think this still is. Education is more of a brainwashing system. I mean, when you learn history, the history is taught to us for reasons of propaganda, and there's no freaking arguing that. It's to make you a good citizen. That's what school is. That's what school is doing. It's school itself. They created the way school is now, came into being after they figured out the factory model with the Model T and Ford and all that stuff. So all of our schooling is based on the factory model. One brain, like we think, every kid learns the same, which they completely don't. Every kid's a special little snowflake in how they learn. Every brain and every consciousness is the same way. Even us as adults, we're all completely different in that way, and how we learn and how we like to learn. It's still a mystery to how people actually learn, right? When you teach, you're just throwing stuff at a wall, seeing what sticks until something sticks, and you use it for a little bit till it doesn't work anymore. But our schools, they make our minds like, I mean, this quote about Einstein, he knew nothing about philosophy and mathematics of time and space before he started learning about it. That's why he was able to be profound, because his mind wasn't, diluted with that stuff. Bentov talks about the same thing. He dropped out of school in like middle school and then was able to, become a respected and great physicist and scientist and inventor. So, but he still worked hard. He didn't just drop out, and then you have to work like really hard when you do that. You have to have a passion about something. That's what I think school should be. School should be a place where you learn what your passion is and you learn how to pursue it, not learning just how to be like a citizen who's gonna leave school, find a nice 9 to 5, and pay your taxes, which is great too. But it'd be awesome if school helped cultivate a deeper understanding, right? And taught us some more practical things. And as a teacher, I do feel that sometimes school leans more towards the brainwashing model of let's just produce people who know how to be citizens. And all the students I work with, that doesn't ever work for them. We have to come up with more creative ways to help them be successful in school, right? Anywho, I'll pause that rant and let's learn about Patrick Price here. Pat Price. Some individuals could be said to have paranormal abilities. For others, the appropriate description is to say that they are paranormal. Ooh, that's sick. Such an individual was Patrick H. Price, an ex-police commissioner and vice mayor of Burbank, a maverick president of a West Virginia coal company, and an Irishman with all the toughness and tenderness that the stereotype implies. He must have been such a fun guy to know. The route by which Pat became associated with the SRI program was typical of the flair and drama that seemed to surround his activities. It began with a phone call from Lake Tahoe. Ooh, Lake Tahoe. Ah, thanks, Mac. Mac, you're making me blush during stream over here. Thank you, man. All right, cool. Anywho, Patrick Price. Thank you very much for the kind words, old Mackie. Really, honestly, Mac, I needed to hear that, so I appreciate you, dog. Anywho, so it began with a phone call from Lake Tahoe. Our story with Pat Price begins with a phone call from Lake Tahoe. If you've ever been to Lake Tahoe, it's beautiful. There's a dude I follow on TikTok, I forget his name, but he researches, he actually has a submersible and takes it deep down in Lake Tahoe. He is a believer of the Tahoe Tessie, the possible Lake Tahoe monster. I gotta find that. If you're watching this on the tubes, I'll throw his TikTok name up. It's like called Tahoe Explorations or Tahoe something like that, but it's really cool. Anywho, started with a call from Lake Tahoe. And this call started like so many other calls they received every month at the Stanford Research Institute. I've been following what you fellows are doing, so I thought I would call and let you know that I have similar abilities, and they are under pretty good control, enough so that I could use them in my everyday life. Ordinarily, at this point, I would begin to think about how to interpret the conversation and thank the person for calling. We try to explain that since we have found that everyone seems to have some latent ability, we are not in a position to experiment with everyone who calls. Well, Pat's going to be like, buddy, trust me, you want to experiment with me. At the same time, we try to avoid giving the caller the impression that we don't believe him. In this case, how nice of them. In this case, however, the caller was a businessman and former police commissioner of Burbank. Harold Puthoff, had met briefly a few years earlier. In fact, as police commissioner, I used my abilities to track down suspects, although at the time I couldn't confront the fact that I had these abilities, and laid my good fortune to intuition and luck, as most of us do. When you feel something like that, we'll just be like, oh, it must have been intuition or luck. But maybe, just maybe, there's something more there. One day, though, I got a very clear picture in my mind of something going down that I couldn't possibly know about by ordinary means. And when I checked it out, it turned out to be true. After that incident, I began to wonder if all this psychic stuff I had put down for years might not have something to it. On an impulse, I read off to him the coordinates of the East Coast site that Swann was targeting at the time and suggested that he try and see what was there. He said that he had not done anything quite like that before, but agreed to give it a whirl. That was on June 1st, 1973 at 5 p.m. On the morning of June 4th, I received in the mail Pat's written response dated June 2nd. It was a 5-page running commentary beginning with the description of the area from an altitude of about 1,500 feet and ending with the tour through the building's interiors. Now remember, Ingo viewed Ingo viewed this site, and he was only able to walk around the island, see the outside of the buildings. Old Pat goes inside the buildings and starts describing the interiors. Mind you, he's thousands of miles away and he's never been here. He's never been inside these buildings. The tour was complete with descriptions of equipment, names from desks, and just to show he was serious, a list of a dozen labelings on file folders locked in a file cabinet. I dutifully passed the information along to our East Coast challenger, confident that there was no way that such detailed information could be true. I was stunned to hear some weeks later that Pat's description was essentially correct, and that the challenger was certain Pat could not have obtained the information by normal means. Furthermore, while we were awaiting confirmation of his first effort, he sent in additional data concerning various situations around the globe that he picked up during his nightly scans. So he'd sit there, Pat, and his nightly scans. What's that remind me of? It reminds me of the mechanics of consciousness, learning about how when you are in a meditative state, you are entering your actual consciousness. And the consciousness is inside of us and outside of us and all around, right? And it's up, we're just parts of the absolute or the universal consciousness. So Pat, he's able to get his mind in a frequency like which is discussed in the mechanics of consciousness. He's able to get his mind into such a meditative state that he could go into that expanded state for a longer period of subjective time and gather information. That's what he's doing when he's remote viewing, right? He's entering that higher state of consciousness and he's slowing down his subjective time so he could stay in that pocket a little longer and come back with information. Much of which involved tense political or military issues which could not be verified until later investigation brought the information to the surface. As the confirmations began to come in, we decided to invite Price to the Stanford Research Institute to participate in a rigorous investigation of his abilities. Although in semi-retirement in Lake Tahoe, California, he agreed to relocate in the Bay Area to be part of our program. Upon his arrival at SRI, our anticipation mounted as we readied ourselves for our first experiments. With our now well-defined protocol for remote viewing of local targets, we felt prepared to carry out a definitive series of experiments, the results of which would be unambiguous. With his rough and ready attitude and a merry demeanor, Pat approached his first experiment with a "let's do it." Thus began the series with Pat Price, who participated as a subject in 9 remote viewing experiments with local targets, a series which would eventually become known to the public via the publication in the British scientific journal Nature. I gotta find that copy of Nature that has the Pat Price's experiment in it, which is it's crazy to me. I mean, it happened in the 20s. In the 20s, it was verified by a laboratory that these 2 women were remote viewing and being able to talk to each other telepathically and know where each other were, right? So it's just interesting that we have this research. Then just like no one cares. Like we don't allow it to enter the mainstream. We don't allow it to actually affect our way of thinking and looking at the world. And it's just it's like here too, they experimented with Pat, with Ingo, with several people just off the street, and other skeptical scientists were actually able to come in and use psychic abilities to remote view. That's what we saw in the beginning in the section we read about the discovery of remote viewing. The one random scientist was able to come into an experiment just to fill in, and was able to see, I keep saying that. My mind is still there and guessing. No, he was able to see. He was able to remote view and see where Hal Puthoff was in Costa Rica that day. And he did so accurately. So again, it's just funny. Like this whole book, Mind Reach, was done in the 70s. We know psychic abilities are real from this point, or at least remote viewing. But how come it hasn't entered the mainstream? How come you still feel crazy even to say that around most people? Conspiracy me is like, oh, you know why? It's because the government has been using, or parts of the government, the illegal dark parts of the government, the military, whatever you want to call it, has been using these psychic abilities for their own pleasure, for their own gain. And it wouldn't necessarily be a gain for them, for the public to know about it. So maybe they're suppressing it for reasons to keep us from accessing, or maybe they're just not telling us because they don't give an ish if we can do it or not. They just want us paying taxes and, you know, chugging along in the little society we've created. So who knows? But it's just odd to me that it hasn't entered. We have proof, but it's not here in, you know, we're not living in it yet, you know? Interesting. In our standard protocol, an experimenter, usually Russell, was closeted with Price at the Stanford Research Institute for 30 minutes before the subject began to describe the randomly chosen remote locations being visited by the target demarcation team, consisting usually of one of three other experimenters, myself, Harold Puthoff, as discussed, and myself, Harold Puthoff. As discussed in the previous chapter, we picked up our traveling orders from the division director, who chose one at random from his safe and departed for the target in this case, Hoover Tower, a landmark on the Stanford University campus. Needless to say, we did not communicate with Russell and Pat. Since Russell never knew what the target was, he could encourage Pat to clarify his descriptions without fear of cueing. Yeah, that's good, right? It's so interesting that like subliminal cueing is part of the things you need to like cover in an experiment, but subliminal cueing seems like a paranormal power in and of itself. That's paranormal. That's like psychokinesis, right? Or psychic communication. Interesting. As we were returning to the Stanford Research Institute a half an hour after looking over the mid-peninsula area from the observation deck atop Hoover Tower, I could hardly wait to hear the tape to see if Pat's apparent ability held up under our protocol. As the tape was played, we heard somewhat a rambling description about a general view of the area, which became tighter and more coherent, gradually zeroing in on the description of a tower-like structure, until finally we heard, seems like it would be Hoover Tower. We sat there, finding it difficult to believe that he had actually identified the target by name. Although the feat was no more spectacular than his original experiment, this one had to be confronted at a much closer range. It may sound strange, but we still find ourselves burdened to a large degree by the collective conditioning of our society, wondering before every experiment how it could possibly work, and surprised every time that it does. We have, however, satisfied ourselves by exhaustive investigation that the result is genuine and not an artifact of a flawed protocol. So it's even here, old Puthoff admitting, even in our experiments, even in our little corner, even in our Stanford Research Institute, we get these results, and every time we get these results, we're shocked, even though we get them over and over. Even every time Ingo comes in, every time Pat comes in, every time we have some geek off the street come in to do a remote viewing experiment, it works, and we're surprised by that every time. We shouldn't be. All right. The fourth target in the series gave me a chance to experience the fraud and collusion paranoia that others sometimes express about us. For this particular experiment, our division director, Bonar Cox, feeling the need to determine for himself personally if there was a possible flaw in our protocol, decided to take us to the target location himself rather than giving us traveling orders. Cox deliberately drove in a random manner, turning himself left or right according to the flow of traffic. By this process, we ended up at the Redwood City Marina. I'll put pictures of that up here. So, okay, look, so this guy, Bonar Cox, What a funny name. Just one letter off from an even funnier name. Old Bonar Cox here. But he's like, nah, I don't believe you guys. So here's what I'm going to do. He gets in his car. He's like, you're going to figure out where I'm going. And he just drives at random, follows the flow of traffic, left, right, left, right. He ends up at a place called the Redwood City Marina, a harbor for local boating enthusiasts. After our required stay, we returned to hear Pat's tape recorded description he made in a shielded room at the Stanford Research Institute. So let's see if Pat got it right. Pat's first taped words were, what I'm looking at is a little boat jetty or little boat dock along the bay. Absolutely right. It is in a direction about like that from here. Points in the correct direction. Yeah, I see the little boats, some motor launches, some little sailing ships, sails all furled, some with the masts stepped and others are up. Little jetty or little dock there. He went on to say, funny thing, this flashed in kinda. Looks like a Chinese or Japanese pagoda effect. It's a definite feeling of Oriental architecture that seems to be fairly adjacent to where they are. He was describing quite accurately what in reality is a restaurant located on the dock. His voice on the tape continued correctly describing the granite slabs leading down to the water's edge, indicating our location as being 4 miles northeast of the Stanford Research Institute, and so on. As the narrative progressed, the excellent quality of the transcript began to raise a paranoid fear in me that perhaps Price and the division director were in collusion on this experiment to see if I could detect their trickery. Only the concern shown by our director as he tried to figure out how we could have fooled him brought me back to equilibrium. So no one is immune to those paranoid or intrusive thoughts, folks. The target, not even old HP Harold Puthoff, grizzled experimenter. The target of experiment 7 was an arts and crafts garden plaza. So again, these remote viewing experiments are extraordinary because of the detail Pat Price goes into. We remember Ingo Swann's descriptions were very detailed and accurate, but Price is going above and beyond here. The target for experiment 7 was an arts and crafts garden plaza known as the Allied Arts, which resembles a California mission. There are craft shops around the perimeter of the plaza, and the plaza area itself are many gardens, flowers, ceramic pots, fountains, and paths. Overhead are vines on arbors of redwood. Pat's description was accurate in almost every detail, and he omitted little of importance. As an example of his output, we include the unedited transcript of this experiment at the end of this chapter. In general, Pat's ability to correctly describe buildings, docks, roads, gardens, and the like, including structural materials, color, ambience, and activity, sometimes in great detail, indicated an exceptional remote perceptual ability. Nonetheless, in general, the descriptions contained inaccuracies, as well as correct statements. A typical example provided by the results of experiment 9. Pat's drawing is shown in figure 11. In which he correctly described a park-like area containing 2 pools of water, one rectangular, 60 by 89 feet, the actual dimensions of which were 75 by 100, pretty close. The other circular in diameter, about 120 feet. The actual diameter of the object, 110 feet, pretty close again. He was incorrect, however, in saying that the facility was used for water filtration rather than swimming. With further experimentation, we begin to realize that the occurrence of essentially correct descriptions of basic elements and patterns coupled with incomplete or erroneous analysis of function was to be a continuing thread throughout the remote viewing work. This observation eventually led to a major breakthrough with regard to understanding the connection between remote viewing and brain functioning. Okay, so let's dive into that. As can be seen from Pat's drawings, which I'll have up on the tube. Sorry, they're just too small and blurry right now. As can be seen from the drawings in figure 11, Pat also included some elements such as the tanks shown in the upper right, which were not present at the target site. The left-right reversal of elements often observed in paranormal perception experiments is likewise apparent, which is interesting. And a lot of these experiments, people describe it correctly, but it's just flipped, like it's mirrored. Okay. And a Stanford Research Institute, an analyst not otherwise associated with the research, with the psychic research, was called in to provide independent evaluation of the experiment. Pat's responses packets, which contained 9 typed unedited transcripts of the tape recorded narratives and associated drawings, were unlabeled and presented in random order. Working alone, the analyst visited each target location in a blind fashion, rated Pat's answers on a scale of 1 to 9, best to worst. The results of the judging, shown in Table 2, included 7 direct hits out of the 9. The overall results was statistically significant at the odds of 35,000 to 1. So remember, Ingo had odds of accurate descriptions of 50 to 1. Pat's are so accurate, it's 35,000 to 1 that it happened with coincidence. The Stanford Research Institute locations from which Pat viewed the remote targets were in an outdoor park, a double-walled copper screen Faraday cage, which eliminates much of the electromagnetic spectrum, and an office. Judging from the matches indicated in Table 2, the use of the Faraday cage electrical shielding does not prevent high-quality descriptions from being obtained. And remember, so our psychic abilities, or our brains, our consciousness, is able to penetrate any kind of shielding like that. That's exactly what Ingo did when he walked into the magnetometer, and he was able to penetrate levels of concrete, copper, shielding, all this stuff, and then manipulate the needle with his mind. Let me see here. Okay. As a backup judging procedure, a panel of 5 additional SRI scientists not otherwise associated with the research and chosen by the Stanford Research Institute management to check our work were asked to blind match the unedited typed transcripts with associated drawings generated by Pat against the 9 target locations which they independently visited in turn. The transcripts were unlabeled and presented in random order. A correct match consisted of a transcript of a given date being matched to the target of that date. Instead of the expected chance results of 1 match per judge, the numbers of correct matches obtained by the 5 judges were 7, 6, 5, and 3. And 3 asterisk. Thus, rather than the expected total number of 5 correct matches from the judges, 24 such matches were obtained. Although the judging procedure is the final arbiter with regard to evaluating whether an experiment is successful or not, it was clear to us that we went along that the results being generated by Pat were of superior quality. To have found 2 individuals, Swann was the first capable of such a high degree of remote viewing, certainly exceeded our expectations for our first year's research. Furthermore, Price was not a professional psychic, which opened up the prospect that perhaps there were many individuals potentially capable of remote viewing. What of Price's view of himself as he turned in success at weird paragraph, but we're going to get through it. What of Price's view of himself as he turned in success after success? In a word, Price was absolutely convinced that what he was doing was very ordinary. In a November 20th, 1974 interview with the Huntington, West Virginia Herald Dispatch, he expressed it in this way. There is absolutely nothing mysterious about it. Just decide. There is nothing specific to do. If a person has convinced himself that he can't with certainty, he cannot. If a person is willing to even concede a slight possibility that he can, then that's a point where he starts doing it. If one observes that it could be useful to him, let it be so. If not, let that also be so. And that just goes with the saying, if you believe you can't, you can't. If you believe that you can, you can. So let's go, Pat. There we go. It's that easy, old Pat. According to old Pat, it's that easy. We just got to convince ourselves that we believe. That's what I'm working on. Come on, cowboy. He was impish about his abilities. In talking with the secretaries at the Stanford Research Institute, he loved to answer the hidden questions that never got asked. With, if I can see anywhere in the universe, why would I want to follow you to the bathroom? His impishness showed up in more forceful ways too, as when apropos of nothing, he casually began to describe to a visitor how he would build a certain type of airplane. A description we were told later corresponded precisely with what that visitor had been exposed to at a closed briefing 2 days prior to his Stanford Research Institute visit. Price's rough and ready approach, ooh, rough and ready, baby, that's what's up. I'm just trying to see here. Okay, cool. Price's rough and ready approach made him ideally suited to the demonstration type of experiment that we are continually tasked with early in our program. In one demonstration for a potential sponsor, our standard protocol sent us to a building in the hills behind the Stanford campus which houses an artificial intelligence laboratory. Crazy, in the 70s, even in the 70s, they had AI laboratories. The building, originally designed to be circular, was only 1/3 completed from forming an arc. Pat's description began appropriately enough with the description of a banana-shaped building. Halfway through the allotted time at the site, our visitor, desiring to test the system, insisted that we jump into a car and quickly drive to another place he had seen on the way, a beer garden housed in a century-old building that had once served as a relay station for the Pony Express. Accordingly, Pat's description changed in midstream to that of a small building with double-hung doors and having some kind of historical significance. We found the bronze plaque later. Boom! They're like, oh, we're gonna trick Pat. Boom! As they're driving, Pat switches what he's seeing to, oh, they're at this little history place now, which they were. On another occasion, he was asked to reproduce, while flying overhead in a glider, a drawing being made on the ground by a visitor. Pat faithfully reproduced a moon and stars target chosen from a label found by the visitor as he searched randomly through a garbage dump on the ground during the flight. Whoa. There appeared to be one error, however. Pat had also included in his drawing a third symbol, a stylized Ankh or onsate cross. I'll put that up here. Ankh. Oh, an Ankh, like the Egyptian-looking cross things. Okay. Our visitor chuckled and pulled out from beneath his shirt, below the pocket, carrying his drawing, just such a cross on a chain, which was never visible from the outside. So Pat was able to fly over this guy in a glider, and then through his mind, he was able to perceive that he had the Ankh on him and reproduce the drawing from the label that the guy found in a dumpster from flying high overhead in a glider. A man for all seasons, Price was also drawn to our equipment being set up for psychokinesis experiments. Experimentation along these lines was being undertaken to investigate the possibility that the remote sensing channel may permit energy to flow from an individual to a remote location, as well as in reverse. There are reasons for thinking this might be so in certain of the quantum theories proposed to explain paranormal functioning. Quantum theories? Pat participated in a long series of experiments in which the goal was to register counts on a Geiger counter, but these proved to be unsuccessful. In a second series of experiments, we examined the possibility that a subject may be able to exert a physical influence on a remotely located mechanical system. The target was a torsion pendulum suspended by a metal fiber inside a sealed glass bell jar in a laboratory some distance from the subject. The position of the pendulum was monitored by a laser beam reflected from a small mirror on the pendulum onto the position sensing detector. So they were measuring the position of the pendulum down to the very down to the very tiniest movement. The output from the detector was monitored by a chart recorder. The subject was provided feedback at the remote location either by closed-circuit video or by a second chart recorder connected to the recorder in the enclosed target laboratory. Pat was to try to increase or decrease the oscillation of the pendulum during 1-minute intervals determined by a random number table. Although there appeared to be some evidence in pilot studies that Pat could by concentration influence the motion of the bat pendulum, data taken in controlled experiments although showing a trend in the desired direction, did not reach statistical significance. So again, they don't even include that experiment beyond the description because it's not one they were able to prove. Pat wasn't able to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that he was moving that pendulum, although the results tended to show there was something going on. Such was not the case for the following experimental series, however. As discussed in the previous chapter, Swann was apparently able to affect the output of a sensitive magnetometer. The conditions of that observation involving, as it did, the brief use of an instrument committed to other research prevented a proper investigation. However, the number of data samples was too few to permit meaningful statistical analysis, and the lack of readily available multiple recording equipment prevented investigation of a possible recorder-only effect. By the time Pat had joined our program, however, we had arranged for extended use of a similar instrument in our lab, the magnetometer. The device is ordinarily used to measure magnetic fields originating from processes within the human body, such as currents in the heart that produce magnetocardiograms. The sensitive tip of the instrument is placed near the body area in interest. In our experiment, however, Pat was located in an adjoining laboratory 4 meters from the probe. As a result, he was located in a zone of relative insensitivity. For example, standing up and sitting down, leaning forward, and an arm and leg movements produce no signals. We asked Pat, as a mental task, to affect the probe from where he was. The results of this effort were monitored at different stages of the system by 3 separate recording devices: an oscilloscope, a panel meter, and a chart recorder, the latter providing a permanent record. Pat was required to remove all metal objects from his clothing and body, and the effects of body movements were checked at the start of each experimental period. A random number table was used to generate a sequence of 10 on subject activity and off subject no activity periods of equal length. For example, 25 seconds each. And that on and off oscillating. We learned about that's exactly what our human bodies are doing in the great consciousness that we learned about in the mechanics of consciousness, which we're going to finish tomorrow, chapter 10. So make sure you're here. We asked Pat to make an effort to affect the magnetometer on and off periods. The trace from the chart recording of a sample run is shown in figure 12. The randomly generated on trials occurred in periods 2, 8, and 9. As shown, signals appeared in each of these periods. A false signal due to the passage of a truck in the parking lot adjacent to the laboratory was noted in period 6. A long series of experiments was carried out, and the observed activity was found to correlate with past efforts to statistically significant degree. Thus, the experiment was a success. Eventually, the results were presented in an international conference on quantum physics and parapsychology held in Geneva that Russell and I attended in the summer of 1974. Pat was, of course, pleased with the success. He felt that by working with such sensitive equipment under good conditions, he had increased his own knowledge of how the physical universe operates. After working with us on this particular experiment, he expressed the opinion that he could write a whole book on physics from the subjective viewpoint. Although, as far as he was concerned, it didn't matter if anyone ever heard about what he did. He had gotten his reward from the activity itself. That's a good man, old Pat. I wonder, was he ever able to write a book? We were also pleased with the results. This was our first statistically significant long-term study of psychokinesis, and the outcome indicated that the remote sensing channel might sustain energy transfer in either direction. Telekinesis is real, folks. The above concept of his rigorous basis in quantum theory in so-called the observer problem, the effect of an observer on experimental measurement, detailed analysis leads inescapably to the conclusion that to the degree that consciousness is involved in observation and measurement, and it always is, to that degree, consciousness must also have been seen to interact with the physical environment. Dr. Evan Harris Walker of the U.S. Army's Aberdeen Proving Ground and Professor O. Costa de Beauregard. Oh, Beauregard! That's one of Bill Dauterive. Beauregard. I mean, that's part of his name, baby. Oh, I love Beauregard, such a great name. Of the Poincare Institute in France have independently proposed theories of paranormal functioning based on these rather esoteric concepts. And let's rewind here. Someone in the Army, Dr. Evan Harris, was studying this in the 70s. So I don't know if you've ever heard of the Army squad of remote viewers, but they are absolutely real and they absolutely exist and are still in operation. There's this one really chill buddy who was one of them. He retired recently. I'll throw his name and picture up if I could remember. But he retired from the remote viewing squad and they had him doing all sorts of crazy stuff, even remote viewing on Mars and stuff. Gnarly. Anywho, so this has been studied by other scientists as well. This idea of paranormal functioning based on rather esoteric concepts, or the idea of that spooky connection that things have in quantum physics, where once you have an encounter with something, you're always connected with it no matter how far away you are from that object. Based on our own observations of Pat and others, we developed a few working hypotheses which we intend to examine in the future work. They are: 1. Researchers in the area of psychokinesis always appear to be plagued by the fact that observed effects are never much larger than the background noise always present. Rather than being perverse, nature may simply be showing us that psychokinesis involves control over noise signals that are always present, rather than the generation of new energies. A bringing order out of chaos concept familiar in Eastern traditions. And this makes sense with everything we read in the Mechanics of Consciousness, right? It talks about how nature prefers harmony. When you're out in nature and all of a sudden you notice that the firebugs are all blinking in unison or all blinking in a rhythm, that happens is because nature prefers harmony. When you notice those sort of things, that is nature preferring harmony. Our bodies themselves, when we are in the most harmony, when we are in a slow breathing pattern, when we are relaxed and we are entering a meditative state, when we're able to slow the disruption of our beating, of the blood flow, right? Because in our blood, there's a point where they collide and it creates like a disruption, and that makes our body kind of out of order. Even when observed, 2, the second hypothesis, so that's the first. Nature loves harmony. 2, the second hypothesis, even when observed, psychokinetic effects often appear to be the result of coincidence. This may indicate that such effects may be the result of a goal-oriented synchronicity that works at a very subtle level beyond the more obvious cause and effect mechanisms. The deep subconscious, again, nature preferring harmony. Psychokinetic effects often appear to be random or spontaneous. This may indicate a connection with weak quantum effects, which similarly appear to be random or spontaneous. That's the third hypothesis. The fourth hypothesis: the more closely one attempts to observe psychokinetic effects, the less likely one is to see them, a factor considered by many to indicate poor observation, fraud, and the like. However, simple dismissal does not stand up under scrutiny. It may be instead that there are interfering observer effects of the type known to occur at the microscopic level. For those prejudiced against the possibility of psychokinesis, the above principles would be labeled as rationalizations or catch-22. However, as scientists responsible for investigating the area, we are not permitted the luxury of dismissing the above possibilities without cause. Finally, we find it useful as a guiding principle to remind ourselves that all the phenomena we deal with in psychokinesis are totally permissible at the microscopic level, within the framework of physics as presently understood. Tunneling through barriers, time reversibility, etc. At the microscopic level, they're already doing this stuff. So why, as above, so below, why can't we do it? Therefore, there is hope that the bridge between the microscopic and the macroscopic can be found, at which point psychokinesis will take its place alongside other phenomena now understood, but equally mysterious when first observed. With the completion of the magnetometer study, Pat Price ended his stay at the Stanford Research Institute to accept a new challenge, a position as president of a West Virginia coal company. We nonetheless carried out further experimentation with him from time to time when his busy schedule would permit. Now, unfortunately, we must bring this chapter to a close by noting with sadness the death of Pat Price due to a heart attack in July of 1975. He will always be remembered by the authors for his willingness to place on the line to place on the line for public scrutiny his very private abilities, a willingness stemming from the stated desire to bring to others by whatever route the realization that an individual is inherently capable of greatness infinitely beyond the ordinary worldview. We have lost a friend, a coworker. The world has lost a courageous and talented explorer. Amen. 1972, July 1975, July, the month of Pat Price, a great American psychic. Rest in peace, brother. He brought us more awareness to the great abilities that all of us have inside. Now, to speculate a little bit, the rumors about Pat Price are also after he left the Stanford Research Institute and took that very powerful job in the coal industry. He started also working for the United States government in its Cold War spying. How could it not? The military was very interested in what Puthoff and Targ were doing at the Stanford Research Institute, so it stands to reason that they use these folks for spy operations, for black ops spy operations. Why not? So it's fun to think about what's still going on. You know, there has to still be a remote viewing squad. If the Army has one that's above ground, that means there has to be one that's more underground, and that's black ops or even illegal government double black ops style. Who knows? So I mean, truly, Mind Reach is such a fun read because these Targ and Puthoff go through great lengths to explain how and why their experiments are legit. These are legit experiments they did to prove that psychic abilities exist. And if you're to believe what they put in the book, which why not? Several other scientists were with them. They have published stuff in the Nature journal in Britain. So to me, that's like a believability scale. I'm 100% on psychic abilities. We all have that deep within us. We just have to be able to believe it and access those higher levels of consciousness through calm meditation or whatever it may be. Like Pat Price says, you just got to convince yourself. If you believe you can't, you can't. If you believe you can, you can. So, I mean, that's something I definitely still need to work on here too. But that is our journey into Mind Reach. That is our Sunrise Book Club for today. Thank you for joining. Again, I'll show here. Whoop, whoop, whoop. Mind Reach. This is the book we are reading. You should definitely go pick it up because it's a good one. All right. But yeah, Mind Reach. You know, I think we're gonna save. Do I want to do ghost stories now? Do we want to save ghost stories? Do we want to do ghost stories? What do you want to do today? I'm trying to think. Maybe we'll play a little game here.